again, thanks so much to Ram for arranging this session and also for you all joining me today. I'm Genevieve. I lead fundraising for the International Astronomical Union. I'm based in Pedro Russo's Astronomy and Society group at Leiden Observatory in the Netherlands, and I work closely with Professor Evina van Bishoek, who is the IAU president. I've been with the organisation for a year now, working with the OAD and other offices such as OAO to develop fundraising for the IAU and the astronomy community. So a bit about me and my background. I'm originally from Scotland. I have actually scripted most of what I'm writing, so I hope I don't talk too fast for some of you who don't have English as their first language. Ram is going to interrupt me and tell me if I need to slow down, so don't worry, we are mindful of that. Personally, I've lived all over the world. I've lived in Singapore, New Zealand, the UK, and my home is now Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where I've lived for the past 10 years. I've worked in fundraising and grant making internationally for over 20 years in senior leadership positions, also designing grant making and income generation strategies from and for high value donors such as trusts and foundations, high net worth individuals, and institutional funders such as the national governments and the EU. The sectors I have experience in include medical research, education, international development, and the women's movement. So before I go on to the actual presentation, just to let you know, there's a huge amount of information here. I'm not going to go through every single point on the slides. The intention is that these will be shared with you all after the presentation, so you've got a chance to go away, read up and think further on the topics raised today. As Ram said, it's meant to be a very broad session and a general introduction, because I understand there's a range of people and organisations that are at varying different stages. So we're doing question and answers at the end, aren't we? So moving on. There we go. Great. So before we sort of go into fundraising, it's always useful to take a bit of a step back and sort of consider, where do you fit within the whole picture? Does this, can everybody see okay? So before you start any type of fundraising as well, it's important to ensure you're ready. There's a great deal of background preparation to have in place before you can start to engage with donors. And this also enables you to proceed with the utmost confidence as well. So it's vital to define who you are as an organisation and where you want to go with your idea and concept. And some of you are only going to be looking for one-off funding for short-term projects. Some of you also were wanting to be developing something more long-term and sustainable. But we're all operating in the same space, astronomy for the benefit of society. So that gives us a really good common ground starting point for today. So a good place to start is, what is a non-profit? Let's be sure we're all using the right terminology as well. It's a legal definition, and it's a legal entity which is organised and operated for a collective public or social benefit. And that's obviously in contrast to a business which is there to generate a profit for its owners or its shareholders. However, this is a legal and tax definition only. And it's important to know the difference, because it doesn't really define as such as what you are and what you want to achieve. It's important because it allows you to access a much more broader range of funding opportunities, but it can be easy to get bogged down into legal definitions that don't really talk about what you do and why you want to do it. So what are you? Are you, for example, are you for impact? Are you there for social benefit? Are you there for environmental benefit? How are you going to deliver what we call social return on investment? If someone funds you instead of a financial return, what's the social return you're going to be providing? These are all important things to consider with your message as you set about establishing your fundraising. So it's very difficult, I will make this point now, it is very difficult to fundraise as an individual without some form of official structure. This is due to taxation and reporting requirements from donors, and it's actually applicable across the majority of countries as well. So it's worth bearing that in mind if you are an individual that would like to do some good work in your community. It's not always that straightforward, as I'm sure some of you have come across already. Ram, am I talking at the right speed? Do I need to go fast, slow?
I think so. If anyone wants Genevieve to go slower, please let us know.
Yeah. No, okay, I'll carry on.
I'm fine with the speed is all right.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. So on to the next slide. And I have two screens going, so one that has my notes and one that has a presentation. So my apologies for jumping around. So it's really interesting as well to take a bit of an overview of what's going on globally and what kind of money are we talking about. So often people think, you know, non-profit can be quite small scale, but if you look at these figures, for example, the scope is absolutely enormous. And we as non-profit organisations and as people working within this sector, we contribute a huge amount to the global economy and also for the global good. International development, I'm going to talk a tiny bit more about that type of income on the next slide, but that's how much is available in international development alone every year. In the UK, you can see it's interesting. It's slightly political. I won't go into it here, but there is, you know, it's actually worth around £250 billion a year to the UK economy. And, you know, figures from the US are enormous as well, where they have the whole tax system is basically arranged around non-profit giving. And just so you know, you are in very good company. There's over 10 million non-profits operating in the world, and we would actually be the 5th largest economy in the world if we were a country, which I always think is quite an interesting statistic to share with everyone. So where is this money? So I mentioned earlier international development. Now, as we all know, there is a disproportionate amount of money within the global north as part of the international development agenda. There are many opportunities and regional differences as well. So be sure to research what's possible in your own country and networks, as well as looking at foreign aid. It may not be applicable to all your organisations either. I see there's probably quite a few people here from India, and you'll be more familiar with this. More familiar than I am with this. There are local restrictions. So, for example, you know, I can't just set up as a charity in India and then transfer that money to a different organisation overseas. So fundraising in India needs to predominantly stay in India, has been most people's experiences. China, again, has a completely different setup. They're very vibrant, very thriving sectors, but it's just worth thinking how is this going to look like for me and my organisation within my context. Middle East and Asia in particular, Malaysia, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, really thriving sectors. And there's very active philanthropy going on, there's very active charitable sectors, it's well established, and there is a mindset of giving already, which is really useful. Latin America is also obviously very active, and what's really interesting in somewhere like Latin America are the links between Spain, for example. Vodafone Foundation has huge amounts of programs in Latin America, and also there's a lot of money flowing between the US and Latin America purely because of the community connections that exist as well. So it's really worth thinking with your organisation, where are people in the world going to have resonance with what you're doing? They may not necessarily be in your country, they might be part of an overseas diaspora. So how are nonprofits funded? This is from the US because it's simply, it's just the biggest, and it's easy to sort of think, well, how does it work? But it doesn't actually vary that much from country to country, not in the West at least. So here's a snapshot to give you an idea. And the general public, by the way, in pretty much almost every single country, certainly in the West and in a lot of OECD nations as well, are always the most generous. Community is always the most generous. And there are, again, going to be regional variations because some of you are based in countries where poverty is a real issue. And there are some countries that have a very heavy dependency on foreign aid and international non-profit organisations. So it really does depend on the picture in your country and how you might want to be working with your communities locally as well as on an international level. So non-profit, where does the money come from then? What are we actually looking at? A lot of people think that, as I've been doing this for 20 years, and a lot of people think I spend my time writing grant proposals, or I write letters to people asking them for €5 a month, or I hold bake sales or things like that. And it's not actually. The picture of where money comes from for a non-profit is massively varied. What we try to do as income generation professionals is ensure that our organisations have a really good mix of all these different types of income, so you aren't too heavily dependent on one or two. That can be quite risky. So there's also many different rules and regulations around fundraising depending on where you are in the world, which we've talked about already. But what also doesn't change are the methodologies that we use to develop successful fundraising and income generation programs for organisations. This gives us a really good platform to discuss how you build capacity for fundraising for your own organisations and your own activities. And these are strong relationship management, clear, concise and engaging messaging, quality programme planning and robust budgets. And across all these income streams, earned income, corporate income, institutional, philanthropy and movement building, which is mainly general public and what we call mass market fundraising, it's all exactly the same. I'm not going to go into each and every single one of these. There's an awful lot here. I do hope you'll have the opportunity to go away, read up on this slide and come back to us with questions for the future, looking at what might be relevant to your organisations. Each of these categories is a specialised fundraising area. There tend to be different rules and regulations governing them, tax rules, for example. And in smaller organisations such as yours, I'm assuming multiple forms of income generation will be done by 1 or 2 people. So you have to be an expert in quite a few different areas, but it's all good. It's all interesting. So general public, as I mentioned, and individual donations are still the most generous. I have a couple of statistics for you from the US. The market leader in fundraising, Americans donated 2.1% of GDP, which is 449 billion. That's just from the general public. There's also a lot of people think that corporates and companies are going to give you lots of money. Corporates and companies are actually the worst by a long way. The lowest source of income comes from corporates. In America, they gave 21.9 billion. So you contrast that to the general public. You also contrast that to trusts and foundations. I'll talk about that in a second. Don't think that companies are there to give you money. This is a trend that is across the sector globally as well. So in the UK, corporate giving, so again, big country, very, lots of companies based there, 1 to 2% of that amount I showed you earlier comes from companies. The reason why they do it is because it's a tax benefit, and also things around corporate social engagement, which is about raising their own profile and their own brand. So you need to be quite wary before you want to start going into business with a company, but there can be some really good ones. And I would recommend that you read up on something which we call ESG. This is environmental, social and governance, and this is what manages something called the Dow Sustainability Index. I will send you all this information so you don't have to worry about it for now. But if you want to partner with some corporates, and in some instances, for example, astrotourism, you may well want to, and it would make sense, consider these sorts of things before deciding who fits with your organizations, your priorities and your ethics. Trusts and foundations, by the way, in the US gave $75 billion. So a proportion of that is for international development as well. And federal law in the US requires trusts and foundations to give 5% of their income away every year. Consider that the amount of money they hold is over 890 billion. That's in the US alone, and the UK has over 10,000 trusts and foundations. This is always a really great place to start, as I'm sure some of you are doing already, in looking at how you can do startup fundraising for your organization and startup fundraising for your programs. So if we want to contact all these donors that I listed on there, as well as communicating with the general public, as well as communicating with what we call high value donors, what's your message? We've got an idea of where this income comes from now, so it's important to look at how we now want to communicate. And this really does go beyond proposal writing. This is the heart and soul of what you actually are. So when we do fundraising training, we use something we call the minibus analogy. This is very, very, very British, I'm afraid. And it used to be that there were a lot of proposals for minibuses that we would receive as grant makers. And we used to have to write to people to say, look, it's not about your minibus, is it really? So now we sort of use this as a tool to get people to think, is it about your minibus or is it actually about something more? Because no one really will fund that type of thing anymore. No one is going to sort of say, I need a tool to do my job. No, they are really interested in a much bigger picture. So it's not about the minibus, which is just a tool. It's about what that helps you organize your organization achieve. It's about why you need it. It's about, let's say, talking about young people. I've got to get young people who are at risk of exclusion to sports and after school clubs, or an astronomy club, for example. This improves their self-esteem. It helps them learn about team building. It's going to improve their educational outcomes, which leads to employability and entrepreneurship, for example. That's what I'm trying to do. What are the tools I need to get there? Oh, okay. So one of the things that's a problem is transport. So I need to help my children get to these clubs. So we're going to have to put a minibus in as part of our overall budget. But your minibus is not part of. The minibus is not the core of what you're doing. The minibus is but a tiny part of the much bigger picture, and that's when your organisation. And that's when it becomes a lot more interesting for people to hear about what you're doing and a lot more impactful. Always front and center of what you're talking about. Also make sure you demonstrate how you're contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. So I'm not going to spend much time here because, again, you're all experts as well in your own regions and your own projects. But there are, going back to my earlier point, there's a lot of regional variation. And this is just from a few different countries around the world. But you can see how vibrant a sector there is. And embassies are also a really great source of funding as well, particularly for access to international development funds. So always have a look and see when you're trying to build, who am I going to approach? Look to see who other people are getting funding from and see if they're similar to you. Look who's funding them, and then you've automatically got your you've got a really strong prospect list already, a list of people that you can approach. So that's just a little tool tip that we often use in fundraising. And so I want to just go back as well a bit to income types and what type of income we're talking about for the types of operations that that we're all doing. Movement building is what it's known as now. It used to be things like direct marketing, where you send something through the door and ask people to sign up for $5 a month or whatever. Now it's completely changed, and digital fundraising has completely transformed that landscape, especially in COVID-19. I'm sure some of you have experienced that as well. There's lots of opportunities. Crowdfunding is really interesting. I think has had a lot of success in astronomy as well. And it's worth investing in your individual fundraising because you're growing your audience steadily over a much longer period of time. So you're building relationships with people who will be with you forever. A really important point, actually, which is applicable for all fundraising, but especially if you're working with individuals and the general public. If you are fundraising from people in the European Union, for example, GDPR applies. What are the data protection laws in your own country? Are you capturing people's data in a decent database so you can ensure that you're protecting their information, but also that you can manage these relationships and manage these contacts going forward? So lots to think about before you sort of can do one-off crowdfunding, but that's just one-off, might be suitable for just one project. I know moving telescopes is quite a common one, but if you want to build up more sustainability, start thinking about how you stay in touch with people and how you get people to keep giving to you. It can really pay some dividends. And on the other side, high value, I've talked about this a little bit already, but relationship management is still applicable. It doesn't matter whether someone's giving you €5 or 5,000 euro. Still important to look after them. Writing is important. I'm sure you've all come across that as well in your grant applications. Networking is critical, and building your network with your donors, building your network with other non-profit organizations, international non-profit organizations like Save the Children or UNICEF, for example. These are really, really important. So get out there as much as you possibly can. Research your prospects before you approach them as well. Understand their needs and interests. Don't waste your time applying to someone who is just never going to give you any money, because that's a bit soul destroying, a bit, it's also just non-effective use of your time. It's very precious. You guys are all very busy. Finally, a thought to leave you with is writing good proposals is obviously a key part, but actually we often say 80% of a high value fundraiser's role is relationship management and 20% is actually the writing. So that's just how important it is to keep building your networks and keeping those relationships going. So in terms of what that message is, how do you shape that message? Some of you may have come across this expression, these terms before. If not, don't worry. There's lots of links and things for you to read up on and explore further. But we talk a lot about theories of change and cases for support. This is expected in international development. It's also expected in pretty much every single area of fundraising now. Any organisation needs to have a theory of change which demonstrates literally, what is it? It's literally your theory of why you're here to make a change. How are you here to make a difference? And the case for support is all the information that goes behind it in one really handy package. So you've planned out your asks and your approaches already, all your messaging, all your statistics, all your deliverables. Everything is within that case for support, and that makes it much more efficient for you then to go out and say, I've got 50 foundations I want to write to, and all I need to do is just look at my case for support and just draft those proposals. So instead of work being donor-led and being driven by whatever calls are out there, you actually become a lot more focused about your organization's, your need, and why people need to come to you, not the other way around. It's very, very powerful. I've got lots of different things in there on what should go into your case for support. But again, if you're thinking, gosh, how do I, where do I begin? The Sustainable Development Goals are the framework and the guide. So look at sort of those. How does my project, how does my program, how am I linked towards the SDGs? Not just in terms of goals, also the targets and also the indicators. How is your program contributing to those? And when you start with that, then it actually becomes a lot easier to map out your theory of change and case for support. You can use all kinds of short videos. Other digital media is really great as well. It's super handy. Ram has very kindly shared with us videos which we use in our messaging when we talk about OAD. So that's all fine. It can definitely be included. And I put a link in for you here, which is the messaging we've developed at the International Astronomical Union on how we position ourselves when we start talking to donors. And I'll go on to, there's some more information further on which I'll share with you on tools and slides. So I'm just keeping an eye on time. I think we're doing okay so far. So there's something that is very close to my heart, which I will talk to you all about very briefly. You see, remember, I don't know if you saw on the earlier slide, but earned income, organisations can earn their own income. Even if you're a non-profit, it's really a fantastic way to think about how you can diversify your income and build a lot more financial sustainability if you have a product that you can sell. Impact investing is something that I've been involved with for about 15 years or so. And it's very much targeted at entrepreneurship. It's also very much targeted at organisations who will generate what we talked about earlier, the social return on investment, as well as financial return on investment. So if any of your organisations are interested in thinking, how do I get out of the box with this? How do I break away from this cycle of project funding, always having to chase around after grant income? We're very keen to ensure that you can move away from that, because it can be very hard work and also means that some good projects end. This might be something that you might want to consider. It's not for everyone, but I've included some information here and also some examples on very successful social enterprises or non-profit organisations that have a component of for-profit work for you to take a look at. Also, I mentioned environmental social governance, ESG, earlier. There is also a link to what that means under an organisation called Rebecco, who are a big asset managers based in the Netherlands. So have a look, it's a lot of information. Some of you may already be familiar with She Speaks Science as well, but Gina is also doing some really great work around developing a for-profit enterprise for She Speaks Science. So that might also be relevant for you to look at. So what are the key actions that you need to do? In order to make sure that you can go out and fundraise, because it's not always that straightforward. Because there's always administration, so always make sure you factor that in. We already talked a bit about this, but what is your legal structure? Because once you know what your legal structure is, that then narrows down what you can and can't do in terms of looking for money. It also depends on what you want to do. What's your vision? Is it a one-off? Are you looking for more long-term? How does that all look? Receiving funds, I know this is challenging in some countries. But it is important to set up a bank account that obviously is in your organization's name and can handle international transfers. If you want to seek funds outside of your organization, that's going to be critical to try and find a solution for that. In Lebanon, for example, where the NOC in Lebanon have done some really fantastic work, they actually went off and set up by themselves so that they would be able to access money to start fundraising for outreach, astronomy outreach work in the Netherlands, and avoid sort of in-country issues around bank transfers. And it's going really well. So it can be done. And always make it easy for people to give you money. There are multiple payment options, certainly across West Asia, for example. PayPal is accepted in pretty much most places. I understand that, again, it's a bit difficult in some countries, but see what works in your country and make sure that people can give to you. And also transaction fees are very important as well. So when you're preparing your budgets, especially for overseas donors, if you're having a US transfer to your country, check your exchange rates and make sure that that is included. It may seem like a silly thing, but I've seen people caught out by that before, and it can make a big difference. Again, tax is huge. What are the tax regulations? How does that matter to you? Why does that matter? It's very important because you don't want the tax man banging on your door. And even in the UK, that still happened with Facebook fundraising, for example. We actually, all UK charities got told they had to pay tax on all Facebook fundraising that happened. So suddenly everyone was presented with a VAT bill of tens of thousands of pounds that they hadn't been prepared to pay. So it is important. Pro bono, which is free, so people who will provide professional services for free. This you should totally try and take advantage of. A lot of lawyers and accountants will advise for free. They all have pro bono schemes, so see if that's something that's possible in your country. And it's important to know who's doing what. Agree who your chair is, treasurer, secretary. Those are the main roles. Those are also the ones that funders ask about. And they are also the ones who have access to your bank accounts. So it's important to know who is managing what and that you can actually access your bank accounts when you need to. And reporting and transparency is really important. So I've included on here a small organization, a very small Dutch organization who I worked with on a campaign, actually an advocacy campaign in the UK and within Europe, and they're very small. They've only raised £6,000, which for us is not a huge amount of money, but they were really keen on showing transparency and how they spent their accounts. So I've just included that for you as an example on how you can do it. It doesn't have to be a huge job, doesn't have to be overbearing. And also see if there's an organization you might be able to partner with who could handle these sorts of processes for you. That's also something that is quite common, I think, in smaller organizations in international development. So it's worth seeing if those kind of things exist in your countries. So the last slide, I'm not going to go into the resources slide and the links because that's for you to take away. I'll just very quickly go through them. What are your key actions once you've developed your logistics? How do you actually go out and fundraise? So it's, as we said, oh, I'm a switch slide, sorry. Develop your theory of change and your case for support before speaking to donors. And what is your elevator pitch? So I sit in pitch meetings where I have people pitching to me their projects, their businesses, or their non-profits, and often they lose the money because they can't convey in the first minute or two what their organization is and why it's so important. So there's some links there for you to consider. Be really targeted, focus on where your efforts will have the most return. I'm a high value fundraiser. We are always sought after because we are very cost effective. We don't need to spend lots of money on expensive marketing or expensive digital programs in order to raise money, but they are the relationships that take the longest to build. Whereas crowdfunding is clear and sharp and short, so it might actually work better in some instances. It all depends on your needs. There is one point I would add here. I don't know if it's so relevant for everyone in this group, but if anyone is fundraising for the IAU, for an IAU project which is affiliated to us, it needs to be coordinated with your other country contacts, because we can't It'll be very problematic if lots of different people apply to similar funders in one country, all saying it's for the IAU. That will cause problems. So in Lebanon, for example, is again my example because we've done a lot of work there. They're actually all working together to produce a countrywide plan so that they can approach as a unified voice. And that's very, very powerful. And I think my final key point on fundraising is that, again, I think I've mentioned it, but don't just churn out applications because that's so much work with little return. I think if you take a step back and you look at your networks and you look at who you know and who can help you, and once you sort out your messaging and your theory of change, then it's a lot easier and keeps you a lot more targeted, and you'll see a lot more success in a shorter space of time. So finally, just on 2 slides, we thought we'd include, if you'd like to go away and learn more about fundraising, because Ram and I also discussed this, should I get a consultant, or should I, should I pay someone on like we call it no cure, no pay in the Netherlands, where people will do the work for you and they won't get paid if you don't get the money in. I would not recommend that at all. I think it's much better for you to build capacity in your own organizations to do this. And there's a lot of free materials out there to help you. And it's very interesting as well. And they also look great in terms of career as well, to be able to do these kind of things. There's no degrees. Master's study is probably, master's or even PhD is normally the level you look at for education, but there are free MOOCs. There is also accreditation which exists. These are just from the US and the UK, but there may well be accreditation in your own countries that you want to pursue. This is just to give you an idea. If people ever wanted a career in fundraising, just putting this in as well, on the sorts of what can you expect as a fundraiser. And I think most importantly, we're working at the cutting edge here, and fundraising has a vital role to play. It's very central to every single organization. And then last slide, I think I'm on time, Ram, 12:34 here. Here's some useful links and references and ideas. This is a bit more on the background of how things actually work in the US, which is where a lot of people look for funding. What is movement building? There's a really good article by Stanford Social Innovation Review. There are actual organizations who will help you build your movement building as well. One called Kinder, which I know that one of the investors on, and that's really an interesting model. So do take a look through here. I won't go through every single one, but as you can see, theory of change, crowdfunding sites, they're very generic crowdfunding sites, and there may well be local ones that are more applicable for you. So I think that's it, Ram. How did I do?
Thank you so much, Genevieve. Yeah, feels like I also learned new things now. So we have some time we have 25 minutes for Q&A. But just to recap for those who joined during the presentation, this is just like this session now is just for giving you a overview of the idea of fundraising, and we hope to have other sessions in the future where we can have more targeted discussions based on your feedback, and also a lot of the statistics and examples that Genevieve used are from US and Europe. I guess that's where most of the money comes from at a global scale, but again, the situation in your country would be specific, so that's something we can either discuss over email or, like I said, in a future session. So any questions? Okay, I see there's something on the chat. Do you plan on having mock fundraising activities to get us some hands-on experience on how it's done effectively?
Oh, that's a really good.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me stop sharing so I can, sorry, so I can all be on one screen again. Apologies. I can always share individual slides. Oh, that's better. Then I can look at everyone's questions. It's a very good question. Actually, role play in particular is used a lot in high value fundraising, so you can practice making the ask. so it's something we can certainly do. I think, as Ram said, whatever people feel their needs are, where do you feel you've got strengths, and where do you think I'd like to develop a bit more? Perhaps if I am sitting in front of a major donor, or I am sitting in front of a trust and foundation, how do I pitch? How do I do that? We can certainly arrange that. It's no problem.
And just to clarify, Genevieve is the fundraiser for the entire IAU, so her time, for the OAD is limited, so it would be impossible to work one-on-one with all of the projects. But having said that, she said that she's available to maybe guide some of the projects. So hopefully we can do that if people are interested. Okay, there's more questions. Okay, Somna Chatterjee says, as a budding institute, how do I start?
I think start with have you got your legal arrangements in place? Are you registered? Have you got your mission? Have you got your vision? Have you done your theory of change? Always do that work first before you start thinking about who am I asking for money, because once you've done that work, it helps narrow down who you can approach for funding. But what you can do while you're in that sort of developmental stage is think, we have what we call our top 20. So top 20 prospects that we would like to approach, and they can be, a lot of people sort of put what we call usual suspects on there because everyone goes to them. They're all the big name foundations, or they're the big, we have the rich list in the UK, and all the, everyone regularly drops that on my desk saying, look at all these rich people. That's not where they are, and that's not where you're going to get your money from. So actually start looking at your own networks while you're doing this work, because obviously in your head and within your discussions you will know what you want to do. So then you start looking within your network and within who how do I get my message out there? Start speaking to people about who you might be able to approach while you're getting all your administration and all your messaging sorted out. So you can start to build your prospect list at the same time. My advice is don't start talking to people actively about fundraising until you're confident about your message.
Thanks, Genevieve. And there's a specific question about fiscal sponsorship from a 501c3 organization in the US to non-US countries.
Yes, that's also another very good question. So obviously I can use the IAU as an example. We are registered in Paris. So if we do receive money from US foundations, there is something called equivalency determination. You know what, it's very complicated. I will send it to Ram. We have a document. It might be easier than going through it all here, but I do have information on that, which I'll send to Ram and he can share with you all. But there is a process in place. What I would say about 501c, I'm sure most of you know, it's very, very expensive. If you want to fundraise in the US, you have to be 100% sure it's going to be financially worth your while, because just to set up as a 501c in the US, 3C in the US is around $25,000 to $30,000. Not worth it, absolutely not worth it. There are other avenues you can use. You may want to set up a friends fund, for example, which is a bit more effective. But I have all this information and I will share it with you. But yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Okay, perfect. Next one is not getting funding can be demotivating. Do you think a review organization can help review the funding applications to pinpoint mistakes and suggest amendments?
It is hard, especially when you're a startup and you've still got to prove yourself. And I think it is really what you're suggesting is very valid. Have you got anyone in your country who would be happy to look at a funder who would be happy to look at your applications, for example? Often there's a lot of workshops, there's accelerators, there's incubators. I think I've included on one of my slides a link to a site called Funds for NGOs, which some of you may be familiar with. And that has often got advice on workshops and guidance on people who are looking for funding. And I really recommend going to those to help build your capacity to do that. And speaking to other fundraisers and other organizations is really vital, because we're all in the same boat. It can be very difficult and demoralizing when you're turned down. But just to give you a statistic in terms of how success rates. If you are writing cold, what we call cold, so they have no contact with your organization, they have no idea who you are, your success rate is normally 1 in 10 or 1 in 12. So for every application that's successful, you're going to be looking at 10 to 12 rejections. If someone is warm to you, so you've done that work with your relationship and with your networks, and they know who you are, you've had a good chat, you know the trustee, maybe one of the trustees, or somebody's advocated for you within the organization, the return is actually 1 in 4. So that's why we talk about network an awful lot, because it reduces down that the depressing amount of time you spend writing cold applications, and you put a lot of work into actually making them warm, and then your success rate goes up an awful lot more. But Ram, I wanted to ask, did the OAD offer some kind of review process as well?
For the proposals, yeah, not specifically the fundraising. Yeah, I was going to just say that. So for the proposals, we do encourage people to get in touch with us before the applications open. So probably around January, February. So we can provide feedback on like the general idea of the proposal and maybe help you strengthen it. But we wouldn't be, I don't think we are qualified enough to provide the expertise on the fundraising side of it. So you know of people maybe who do this, like the fundraisers themselves, would they do this pro bono to?
Yeah, it depends on where you are in the world, but there's often capacity building workshops, and that's why Funds for NGOs is a really good place to look. A lot of the INGOs sometimes offer this as well, in terms of running fundraising, like face-to-face fundraising workshops. So going back to the first question, what do I do? How do I practice? It's worth looking to see what exists in the country, and they will go on that site. Funds for NGOs is free, by the way, as well. It's about $50 a year if you pay for a subscription, but there's an awful lot of free stuff on there, and you can see these types of events too. So I would recommend keeping an eye there as well.
Funds for NGO, is it on your resources list?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I'll put it in here though, just in case. It's give me 2 seconds. I can't multitask. For NGOs, and they are. Hang on a second. I've lost everybody. There we are. That one.
The next one is fundraising different for a new project versus an older or existing organization? For example, we put all our eggs in one basket and depended on one funder for many years, and now it has dried up.
Normally when you are a startup, you would have 1 to 2 funders. Somebody is investing, like doing seed funding into your organization, into your concept. Obviously, Hannah, I don't know how it works for your organization now, but or back then, but it's very common just to have 1 to 2, maybe 3 as you begin. But what you mentioned is actually, a classic issue in the sector, is that people do tend to sort of have this over-reliance on a small amount of donors. And that's why it's vital that you get more people on board and you diversify your income base, because they can suddenly just turn around and say, no, we're done. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Aflatoon International. I was head of fundraising at Aflatoon, which is Amsterdam-based NGO, but they provide social and financial education around over 100 countries, and they started actually in India. And they relied on 4 donors for 15 years. It's just, not going to happen. So that's why they brought me on board, was to start diversifying their income. And in an international development context, in all contexts, actually, there's a lot you can do to change that and make yourselves less dependent, which is a personal passion of mine. So it's what you'll see now with startups is they will only fund you for a set amount of time. Unless you've got someone who's very passionate about what you're doing, and it tends to be an individual major donor or wealthy family who will keep funding you, that hardly ever exists anymore. And even like some of the major donors I work with who are now taking over we see a big generational shift in how people are giving as well, at high value and sort of family trusted foundations, in that older generations are very happy just to write a check. and they just want to keep supporting the same thing. Newer generations are all about impact, and they are all about how making their money go the extra mile, and they don't really have the same attachment to projects. They expect them to give a shorter term investment, and then for the organization to grow as a result of that investment.
The next one is, what are the big no-nos to remember while writing proposals?
Gosh, the list is long, but I'm sure you're all mostly familiar with them anyway. And then actually, I'd love to do a session where we all just sort of pooled our expertise together, because I will have lots to learn from you as well. For me, and again, a question maybe others have thoughts on too. Is very simple things like getting people's names right really matters, but you'd be surprised at the amount of very generic things that come through the door. And Ram, I'm sure you've probably got some thoughts on this as well. But make sure you're addressing people properly, that the address is correct, that your site, it's small stuff, but it does make a real difference. And don't just blanket, don't just have one proposal that you just send out to 100 people. Make sure that it's tailored, suitable to the funder or the call that you're applying for, and don't make it too long as well. So if there is, make sure you check in advance with the donor if there is a length that they want. Normally, I don't know how much we ask for, but normally 4 pages is actually more than enough, even for very big proposals like MasterCard Foundation, for example. For like $1 million proposal I did, it was 2 pages for the concept note. So, it's make sure you keep it very short, very concise, and very, very targeted. Don't send like 10 pages and then 20 like brochures. No one's going to read it, unfortunately. People just don't have time. Any other thoughts, Ram, and anyone else?
Yeah, I also wanted to add to that. I think the biggest challenge we have seen in the proposals is what you refer to as a minibus situation. So we get a lot of proposals asking for funds to buy telescopes. So the proposal, would talk about other things the group would do with the telescopes, but the focus itself would be on the purchase of the telescopes. So then we would go back to the team and say, okay, you have to focus on the changes. What are the outcomes of your project? Telescope in this case is just a tool to achieve that. Are there any other questions?
I would just add to that, Ram, sorry, what you just said. It's really going back to the slide. That's why the theory of change is so important, because your theory of change will map out all of that. It's not just it's what is the impact you're going to have. What is the it's not just about I need this. It takes you through theory of change will take you through a series of process. I guess it's like a process, basically. What is your work package? What are your priorities? What are the outcomes from that? And from that, what is the impact, and what is the super impact? But you also start, what's the problem? So I'm not going to talk about it too much, but Ram's absolutely right. It's very important to be referencing the impact and the change you're going to be making in your proposal.
Can you share something about the funding situation due to COVID, the global situation?
I can't talk obviously for individual countries, and we've got quite a really great range of people from different countries here today. We haven't seen, it's a bit of it was a bit of a myth that funding would drop off. What we saw in the UK, for example, that where people were really in need, so for domestic violence organisations, for example, or for projects that worked on poverty, inequality, people actually still wanted to give, and actually donations went through the roof in some of those organisations, and it was also because they had marketed themselves well, and these are even small organisations too, not necessarily big ones, because their message was out there, and they said, this is why we still need your support, this is why we still need your help, and the money was still there. That's just from general public. Trusts and foundations and major donors are a little bit different. So we've heard sort of some bit of hedging from trusts and foundations saying, oh, my investments might be a bit low, blah, blah. But they will still give to you if you have the right relationship with them. And that's why it's so important. Also major donors, family income, private wealth has grown, as we know. I don't want to refer to sort of the world's billionaires, but even even lower down that scale in terms of high net worth individual, they haven't stopped giving, and they actually recognise the need to make sure they keep maintaining gifts at that level because of COVID. So it all goes down to, are you making your case properly? And if you aren't, it is competitive, obviously. If it is competitive, can you collaborate? Can you work together? Can you work in partnership? How do you make your case stronger? And when we see that happening, then we don't see that there's an issue so much with accessing funds. The money is still there. It's just you might have to shift your focus a little.
Okay, Tawanda says, Genevieve, you have helped raise funds for the IAU's Astro4Dev projects. It's not always easy to define the theory of change. What advice would you have for projects in raising Astro4Dev finance?
It's interesting because Ram and I just did a big meeting on Monday across all the offices, didn't we, Ram? Like, what are we going to do? What do we need money for? How are we going to do it? And we showed actually the theory of change that we're developing for Pale Blue Dot. And one of the things we found with Pale Blue Dot is, I'm sure some of you know Michelle Villebrands, who I work with in Leiden. She's at the EROAD. One of the things we talk about, how do we prove this works? So actually, our theory of change for Pale Blue Dot is going to have a very big research component, a very big monitoring evaluation component, because we want to demonstrate this actually works. I think, in terms of how do you define it, I think I don't want to say problem, because I think it's quite exciting, like to bring something very new to the development sector, is that, you have to evidence base it. So I would suggest to wonder that we need to do some more research first, but that actually in itself is quite an interesting proposition. I think a lot of donors are quite interested in that, building that research base and looking for a novel and different intervention. I think for astrotourism, I think it's a lot more straightforward. It's very clear. We know this work. Like, astrotourism is great for development, is great for job creation, preventing migration, putting in local infrastructure, and as well as developing STEM capacity within a country. So I think what also is helpful is if we look at them in different examples, and then we can start developing the case for the whole. Does that sound about right, Ram?
Yeah. I also wanted to ask exactly the same. So, projects are still, most of them are small scale, and gathering evidence it's a difficult process. So, what level of evidence is required, and are there donors who can be approached with just sort of basic numbers, not really impact, not even outcomes, but just I have reached these many kids at school, or I've done these many activities. For a donor who's giving $5,000 or a few $1,000s, would they still need the proper evidence of impact?
It's a really good point. Actually, what's important there is the lived experience, I think. So having some really strong case studies, I didn't mention that in the slides, I probably should have, is that is as valuable as, here is my beautiful RC randomized controlled trial with blah, blah, blah. Actually, if you can say, this is the journey of someone who's been through our programs, then that is a lot more powerful, actually. Trusts and foundations in particular really like that. I think the challenge with that kind of, we've reached X amount of children, and that's the only metric you have, that's the only sort of that doesn't really sort of show the impact, is more with institutional funders, because they are looking to build that in, because that links straight back to what their countries are doing towards the SDGs. So that's where it becomes a little bit more problematic, because they're looking for that specific evidence to take back to their own monitoring requirements for the Sustainable Development Goals. But even then, it's still not impossible. So I would switch it. I would change it around and make it more about, we know this group of children have done this. Here's some stories. Here's some really, lovely imagery, videos, whatever, tell that story. You know, fundraising is just as much about telling a story as it is, you know, writing a very technical proposal, and actually, if not more so important, actually. So, I mean, we could do, I'm not a communications expert, but it would be fascinating to do another session, which is around how do you communicate all of this? What are all the tools that work? What does a digital strategy look like, you know? And that it all comes into that. But I think just thinking on Tawanda's, how much time do we have left? I don't want to take up too much more time, but just on Tawanda's point around defining astrophodev, I think the thing that I've always thought is really handy is that it's not really about astronomy, it's about what is that change. So I can use astrotourism as the classic example, is that, you know, we use astronomy as a I don't want to say excuse, it was just a really great gateway into actually doing a whole lot else, and nobody really thinks about astronomy in that way. So every time I take astronomy to an impact investing group or to a funder, they're like, God, I had no idea astronomy could do all of that. And it's that kind of catalyst that we're looking at. You know, astronomy is that catalyst to doing so much more, which I think is really the extraordinary thing about astrophodev. And the fact that it's new, like people are a bit tired of the same old, and we have something all your projects, you know, you have something very, very different and very unique to offer.
Yeah, for sure. That's our USP. So is there anyone else from the OAD? I see Tawanda, Kevin, Hannah. Anyone want to say anything to our projects before we close?
Yeah. Hello. Good day, everyone.
Hello, hey.
Yeah. I'm a member of the Astronomy Club of Cameroon, and we have a project in collaboration with the National Outreach Coordinator of distributing telescopes, like bringing astronomy into Cameroon through the distribution of
We lost you. Hello?
telescopes, and like organizing astronomy competitions around the country. First of all, one of the main like problems we're going to be needing for funds is this for like importation taxes and the value-added taxes, which is a total, I think, of 19.25% in Cameroon. I think they're equally, we're going to be needing transport there, like to move from one region to another, because we're trying to reach all of the regions in Cameroon, like all of the individual regions, the 10 regions in Cameroon, like trying to establish astronomy, having a good, strong foundation. And so we're going to be needing like transport fare is going to be a barrier for us, and the taxes, like the importation taxes, in order to import the telescopes from. I think if I discussed well with the National Outreach Coordinator, he said it states so the tax.
We can't hear you anymore.
And the fare, the transport, like the ship, the telescopes from the United Ethic taxes. And so me personally, as a member of the committee, I'm going to be needing funds personally, as like on my part, to participate in the project, in order to since I'm in like the first year undergraduate, I'm going to be needing the funds to distribute telescopes in my own region, the center region of Cameroon, like the capital, since I'm in the capital. So to move from one region to another, create posters, create t-shirts, like print a logo and everything on the t-shirts and so on. Hello, do you get me?
Yeah, your voice is breaking up. Would you mind just typing out the question briefly? Otherwise, we can check it over email.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's best to speak to your national outreach coordinator, actually, because who will be in touch with Lena Canas, who is our global coordinator at the OAO, and she has a lot of experience in this. And so how it works is normally you would get in touch if you are a NOC, anyone who's here from a NOC or anyone is here from astrophodev. is speak to those communities first, because they will probably have some experience in dealing with this as well already. Like I know Lena has done quite a lot around, certainly around telescope movement. And that's where things like crowdfunding come in very handy, because the community are all, actually the astronomy community is great at just pitching in for these types of things. You should budget for taxes within your, you should just put that within your budget. Everything, you know, what is it you need to deliver this program properly? But I would advise getting in touch with your NOC and asking to speak to Lena, and taking her advice, because she's done an awful lot around this, and then we can help. But you're welcome, obviously, to email. I'm just not sure how it all works, Ram, who emails who.
Yeah, if anyone has questions or wants to follow up, just email me, and yeah, then we can. Okay.
Yeah.
I see there's a suggestion from Samir. All right. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we'll end here. As I said, we want to offer another session, maybe few months later. I don't know, depending on when people are available and if people are interested in another session. I'll email and get your feedback on this session, what you found useful, and then what you would need for us to arrange in the next session. Okay, any closing comments from you, Genevieve?
No, just I would really love to hear from everyone, what your experiences are, what your needs are, where you've had your successes as well, like, so we can all cheer each other on. And I know that there's been some really fantastic work done already. And I think it's just as Ram said, just any sort of thoughts, food for thought, let us know. But we would love to convene a further session and try and sort of maybe go do a deep dive into certain other things, any areas that you're interested in. I am going to send the information on 501c and equivalency determination to Ram for you to circulate to you as well.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.